simply, again, some of these terms are unfamiliar to most folks. And so I just put a handful of them down. It says terms and dates and terms. And as I mentioned last week, and I'll mention again, dates are very, very open to debate. This is a time in history when the records are so thin, people who study this for decades and decades disagree on some basic issues. So that's my caveat and excuse for it. So anyways, I put this together, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the religious developments here, and there's a little bit about what we in the West call caste, and anyways, you can look at that. The other one is a map, a map of the area where the Buddha lived and taught. And there's some, just a couple of indications of certain events. Thank you so much. And down below is the background of his monks that we'll talk about, which I find very interesting. Basically, they're from the city, and they're middle to upper class Indians. They're not poor people, And then the back of it we'll get to is the political situation around the time of the Buddha. So let me welcome folks officially here tonight. It's really an honor for me to be here with you all. You have seemed to have survived the weather from last night and this morning, which is a good thing. And I'd like to begin by thanking our very wonderful host here at the library, beginning with the library director, Star Electronica, who seems to do everything here and is incredibly helpful for me. The electrical work by Matthew Wozik, who's the electronic specialist. Seth Thomas put out the publicity. He's the Brattleboro Town Communications Coordinator. And a special thanks for Maria Dominguez, a very talented and wonderful, wonderful videographer, and a wonderful human being. Maria, always a pleasure. So to begin, I'd like to sit quietly for just a minute. I know a few of us have been upstairs, and so we've been sitting for a few minutes, but we live busy lives. You all have things going on, so let's just bring ourselves fully to this place with these wonderful people. Hopefully some interesting sharing taking place. Let's appreciate the fact that we really need to slow down in our lives. We need to learn to be quiet. And I want to bring a spirit of gratitude to tonight. We all have challenges. And yet we're in the place, this time in history in which we live, beautiful part of the world. We have light and heat. Most of us have food and health care. Maybe not everybody. But I think that we have a lot to be grateful for. And my gratitude tonight is that you all are here to share your lives and to share the world with each other. So again, thank you for being here tonight. I'm grateful. I am honored. Each and every one of you. So the topic tonight is the Buddha as leader. And we'll be looking at his leadership in terms of his organization, his community, what we call the Sangha. In India at the time, Sangha meant group gathering. There were political sanghas, there were social sanghas. This was a religious sangha. And also his leadership in what we might call the geopolitical realm. in Eastern India. He was an actor. He had thousands and thousands of people for whom he was responsible, living in a pretty volatile part of the world that I'll talk to you about. You know, in many ways, for me to imagine life in India 2,500 years ago, as I sit here very comfortable with you all, and I have enough food and enough clothes on me. It's pretty quiet outside, safe and good. It's a long distance. And the talk tonight is part of an ongoing project, and I'm writing a book on Buddhism and politics. And the first part of the book is about trying to understand the political perspective of Buddhist leaders, both in terms of ancient Buddhist leaders as well as those today. And then applying something of a Buddhist model, a set of principles, Buddhist set of principles, you know, nonviolence, compassion, love and kindness, to social issues. Poverty, violence, criminal justice, the climate crisis, racism, sexism. So I'm a political scientist by occupation. I've been teaching this for a long time. I've lived all over the world. I've taught in a lot of different places. I teach in prisons and inner cities and rich kids and poor kids and a lot of different kinds. And so to me, you know, there's a lot of questions. How do we proceed at this time in history? And so the next talk is about those Buddhists called so-called engaged Buddhists, so-called engaged Buddhists. These are Buddhist leaders who are also political activists. And this represents a so-called another stage in Buddhist history. Historically, Buddhists have been political, but in a much quieter way. One can argue that everybody's political, just by choice of where we shop, who we visit, etc. All sorts of things. These are political decisions, right? And so. And the question I have at the heart of all of this is, what does Buddhism have to say about the political situation today in the world? The question, and implicit in that, does Buddhism have anything to offer us in 2022, 2023? Simple fact, in my opinion, the world is burning. And it's burning in front of our eyes. And the question is, what are we individually and collectively going to do about it? We obviously have leaders who turn a blind eye and flee from the reality. Others embrace it with great fervor and great hope. And so in the talk next time, next month from now, the 21st of December, I'm going to look at some of the people, Buddhist leaders, and see what they had to say about this. All these, not all these issues, but many of these issues. How do we approach the situation today at this particular junction in history? You know, I'm reminded as I think about this, you know, Albert Einstein, this is very cliche, but I'll use it just the same. And he's quoted as saying that, you know, you cannot use the same thinking that brings about a problem to solve the problem. You need to think a little bit differently, a different perspective, possibly a different paradigm, a different model of thinking. And it seems that as much as we need knowledge and information today, we need imagination, and maybe more so. We need to imagine how this can be better, how this can be different, how we want to live. And so the question is, you know, what does Buddhism offer us? And I think it offers us quite a bit. Joanna Macy, one of my favorite authors, Buddhist leaders, talks about the fact that we need to see the world with new eyes. We need a vision. We see the world with new eyes. And what this means is that it requires imagination. And the question, it seems to me, is can we effectuate transformation? Individual, collective transformation. And in simple terms, this transformation must involve moving beyond a basic dualistic approach to the life, to the world and to our lives. This is good, this is bad. This is us, this is them. This is me, this is everybody else. And I think at the heart of the Buddhist teachings is that this notion of separation, in fact, this notion of separation is a creation of our minds. That there is a fundamental unity in this life and in this world. And again, for me, a Buddhist politics means that we have to look beyond the dualisms in our own heart. Where is the Donald Trump and Barack Obama in my heart? Both of them at the same time and in many ways on the same continuum. Or do I reject one and embrace the other? And I think that one thing that Buddhism can bring, and what I, in terms of my evolving thinking about what a Buddhist politics means, is to move beyond this idea of separation, to move beyond the sense of dualism, the fact that we are here and everybody else is out there. And again, this takes work. It just doesn't happen. It means we have to bring our life together, we have to live ethically as best we can, we have to ideally have some type of a spiritual practice, whatever that may be. To learn to quiet ourselves, to learn to be with our deepest selves, our quietest selves. And it is from there a wellspring of kindness and love and compassion. It's got to come from our heart, the heart of our hearts. And it just doesn't happen. So, that's what the big project is about. Next week, I'm going to talk in more detail about what this contemporary Buddhist political vision looks like. And I have found that I've been reading political science for 35 years at this point. Some of the most astute political scientists are the Buddhist teachers who have probably never taken a political science course, because they speak to the reality of the human condition. They speak to the reality of what this life is truly about. The economics, the utilitarian economic man, when you take economics 101, just a little sidebar here to make the point. The economic man has one modus operandi in the world. It's self-interest. That's the basis of economics field and our particular capitalist system and the rationale behind it. It's all about self-interest. And I think a good Buddhist would say, good enough, that's a start. Dalai Lama talks about mutual interest. I have to take care of myself, and I also need the help. Not that I'm going to take care of you, but I need to help do what I can to make sure that you're taken care of. We have mutual interest. Anyways, so the question is, what might that vision look like? So, the first part of tonight, we're going to talk about the Buddha's community, what we call the Sangha, S-A-N-G-H-A, the Sangha. And before I get deeply into this, I want to reiterate what I said at the very beginning of the last talk, is that, first of all, I am not a Buddhist scholar. I have a PhD in political science and a couple of master's degrees in other fields, but I am not a lifelong researcher of Buddhism. There are those who are, and so understand, I am a student of Buddhism. I've been practicing a daily meditation practice for 45 years. So from that point of view, it's been a big part of my life, and yet academically, It's been the last 10 years. And I'll just say what I used to study as a political scientist is U.S. foreign policy in the post-war and response to revolution, with a focus on especially the war in Iraq with the Contras. I did a lot of work around that years ago. And that is, I guess, different, but everything's connected. So I approach this with great humility. I am learning on a daily basis. One of the great Buddhist scholars, early Buddhism, Richard Gombrich, says, the more I learn about this, the more I realize I don't know. The more I realize I don't know about this. And I subscribe to that approach. The second piece is that the evidence historically, archaeologically, in every way of, much before 200 BCE, 250 BCE, the great Emperor Ashoka in India, some of you may have heard of or be familiar with. The scholars are pretty clear. Before that time, the history, the evidence is very, very thin. And therefore, scholars who study this deeply disagree fundamentally because the evidence is so thin. And a very simple example of that is scholars do not agree when the Buddha died. Something as basic, therefore, when he lived. Everyone agrees, scholars agree that he lived for 80 years. The question is, did he die in, when I started to study this, it was 563, he died in 483. And it has all sorts of implications of what else was going on around India. In the last 20 years, scholars have come to a general, very general, not full consensus, that he died about 400. 80 years. Think about all the things that happened in the last 80 years in this country. And India was going through an unbelievable rapid change at that time as well. The point being that not only do I approach this general field with great humility and tentativeness to a certain extent, but also the fact that anyone who says that this is absolutely the case probably hasn't looked very deeply at it. And so, anyways, I present that as a caveat simply, and I could introduce every sentence by saying, we believe that, and then following, but I'm not going to do that because that would be a little bit tedious. But I have to say that when we begin here. Okay. So, we're saying that the Buddha lived, and again, I have a few dates here. We can look at this, the religious development, this here. What I want to do is talk about the Sangha. The Sangha is the Buddha's religious community that he led as the teacher. And of course, he lived, well, I'm just going to use the dates, the 5th century. By 5th century BCE meant from 400 to 500 BCE, before the Common Era. And if we look at this, we can see the Indus Valley. Again, these dates, people debate them like crazy. A couple thousand years. Surely the Indus Valley, which is in western, if you look at the map with the map that says India 600 BC, you see the Indus River Valley. They're way over on the west. This is very important. Indus, the so-called first urbanization, the first so-called civilization in India is on the western side. It's in Pakistan today. The folks who come to dominate Indian life are known as Aryans, A-R-Y-A-N-S. And the language they speak are Indo-Aryan, which comes down, it's a branch of Indo-European, which heads off this way, Indo-Iranian, that becomes Indo-Aryan. These are folks, they come from the steppes, the Central Asian steppes, north of the Caspian Sea, north of the Black Sea. And they make their way down through that area into what is Afghanistan, into really Iran, Afghanistan, what is now Pakistan, but into the Indus River Valley. When they arrive, very roughly 2000 to 1500, 1800, someplace around that BCE, the Indus Valley civilization has basically collapsed. And folks have spread out. There's no great cities. There's no great political power. There's no great king in the area. People are living in villages, people are in tribes. You have a lot of pastoralists who are following cattle here and there. Agriculture is not pervasive by any means. And so what happens during that time is that slowly but surely, 2,000 to 1,500 people begin to migrate across India, into central India, and they move to the incredibly rich soil of the Ganges River basin. And again, one of the greatest, richest, agricultural places in the entire world. And eventually what happens is this great urbanization that I talked about last time. Very simply, what happens is that, number one, this draws, population continues to grow. They start to use iron widely. They chop down the massive, incredibly thick forests. They plant food. They grow more food. The population grows. They have a surplus of agriculture. They sell that surplus. Merchants begin to grow everywhere. Towns begin to grow around the trade, and then cities grow from those towns. And you have this huge commercial network that develops in northeastern India. And money begins to be used for the very first time. And all of a sudden you have the emergence of what we would call a middle class. And these are the merchants. And on the four-part sort of social class system, they're the third. They're the priests, and then they're like the warriors and the government officials. That's where the Buddha came from, right? His father was a politician. That's where he's from. The top two are the elites of ancient India. And then you have the third class, which is sort of looked down upon, the merchants. But at the time of the Buddha, what happens is that the merchants are making a killing. Number one is that in eastern India, and again, if you look on the map, you'll see, this map here is where he lives. And the center of that, if you look at the lower right-hander, is Magadha, which is the greatest, most powerful state. If you look at the big map here, it's in the middle of the right side, Magadha next to Anga and the others. And so anyways, just to stay with some of these general outline and introducing, the Buddha's world, is the fact that at the time when he's alive, the 5th century, you have this unfolding of this incredible economic development taking place in the area of India, all this area here that we're talking about. And you have a time in which not only is it economically exploding, it's politically changing dramatically. Because before that time, you had people living in small villages. And a lot of those times, you had something of a democratic process. It was often the men, sometimes the women were allowed, depending on what part of India you were in. But basically, the head of the tribes, the head of the clans, would get together. These tended to be the oldest men in the family, the patriarchs. They would get together in an assembly. And they would have rules and they would have guidelines, what we would call laws, as to how they make decisions, and they would make decisions collectively. So there was a representative quality to these very small communities. And, they didn't travel far. They, a lot of them, for religious reasons, they were so-called endogenous, which meant that they only married within their particular group. They would not marry outsiders. So anyway, so what we see here is that this political, economic sort of evolution taking place from Western to Central to Eastern India. And the Buddha grows up amidst this incredible transition, this incredible time of dynamic change. Now, and so that's the social, political environment there. Hey, Ken. Hey, Ken.
Oh, I didn't hear you.
No, that's good.
I'm so occupied at the moment.
No,
Yes.
good.
Hello, Roshi.
Nice to see you. Lovely. So in terms of the religious context, the religious backdrop into which the Buddha steps into as a young man, the question is, what was it like? And there's a lot going on. If we go back well before his time, the religion that the Aryans who come down from the steppes, they bring in, and according to certain scholars, the folks who came into northwestern India tended to be mostly men, and that they had children with the indigenous local women. And so you had the language Indo-Aryan that becomes Sanskrit. I mean, eventually becomes early Sanskrit, or Vedic Sanskrit for this time. But the local people were speaking, you know, traditional languages. And so there was this very, very interesting mix between these folks that come in from the northwest. They come in with horses, they come in with chariots. They become the dominant cultural presence in India. And the local indigenous people are not as powerful politically or militarily, and then you have this very, very interesting mixing of the two. Scholars debate endlessly what the folks, the Aryans, brought in from the outside, to religion, to the caste system, all of this, and what the indigenous folks, everything from yoga and meditation, did that come from indigenous folks, or was that actually somewhere about 1,000 miles to the north, coming from the steppes in north of the Caspian Sea? And the question is, we don't know. Scholars put together the best evidence, they make their argument, but there's no consensus at this point in terms of how much the folks who came in, the migrants brought, and how much became indigenously. But over time, it merges into a single culture. And this is what's called Vedism. Vedism is the so-called religion. I just finished a book, said it's not a religion, it's a civilization. I say, fine. And again, these are scholars. 9 out of 10 say it's a religion. This guy says, and he knows more than 99% of the people in the world about this, he says it's not a religion, it's a civilization. So fine. Anyways, but it's led by priests. The priests were doing sacrifices, fire sacrifices. Very, very important. They begin with food, then smaller animals, and eventually they have the great horse sacrifice, which if you're the king and you're being inaugurated, you'd probably have a horse sacrifice done by literally a small army of priests. You pay them very handsomely. That's how they make their living. And in theory, it would bestow, the god would look kindly on the king and also the people. The sacrifice may literally take a whole year to take place. Anyway, so the Vedism is focused on that. And there's much more to it. There was heaven, there was hell, there were lots of gods. Anyways, there were the priests, and knowledge was passed on. Veda means knowledge from father to son to son to son. It's passed on. And the Vedas themselves were hymns, and these were hymns that the priests developed, often using soma. Soma was probably scholars think a hallucinogenic, basically psilocybin mushrooms. And a lot of the hymns supposedly came from that. Again, do we really know? No. But Soma was one of the main gods at that point for Vedas. I'm going to jump to the Brahmanism. Brahmanism is a major, major leap, huge leap in Indian history, Indian religion, and this is it's called the Vedanta, the last of the Vedas. The Vedas end about 500. The Upanishads come in 900, 800. These again are certain texts that come in. Everything's oral at this point. Although some people will say there was actually writing. Other scholars say that there's no clear proof that there was a writing system, even if you had some sort of things that look like writing, certain different symbols. So Brahmanism, 900 to 200, is the religion, the dominant religion into which, that culture into which the Buddha steps into. This is the environment. Brahmanism was very, very strong in Western India, what's now Pakistan, Central India, but in the Buddha's area, it's tentative, it's modest. You have Brahmin towns where everyone's Brahmin, but they're a minority. I'm guessing, this is really off the top of my head, we're talking 10, 20, 30%, depending on what part of India. In some of these towns, in the West, you actually have important Brahmin towns, but you have other places where they don't know anything about Brahmanism. Again, India is a huge place. We're talking hundreds of miles between this area here in terms of where the Buddha lived and where he traveled. And so what you have, and these are very important, and the Buddha basically comes to accept some of the basic principles of Brahmanism. There's a early Buddhist scholar, Sue Hamilton. She's on the list here. She wrote this, what I think is a wonderful book about this time in history. And she says, what happens with the Brahmanism is one of the great sort of movements in all of religious history. The Brahmins developed through the Upanishads, which is again a whole set of sort of texts, oral texts at the time. Some would argue it's written, but I don't think the evidence is there. But then all of these texts that the priest would develop and that they would pass on and they would develop and work. And we're talking hundreds of years. This is generation after generation after generation of discussing and debating. And what they come up, and basically what is behind all this is that there are all these gods in Vedism. They're looking for one power, one entity that pulls it all together, that explains everything in the world. Doesn't it make sense that there's one great power to do that? And over many, many years, there develops this power, and this becomes not power, but it's a spirit. And this is what's called Brahman. There's lots of definitions. I took bits and pieces. The ultimate reality of the universe, the ground of being. This is the very nature of the entire universe is Brahman. Everything comes to Brahman. In theory, everything returns to Brahman. When they sound the ground of being, it's the very basis of the universe and of life. On an individual level, we all have a little Brahman in us called the Atman, or a soul. And the idea of our life, and this is where meditation and yoga comes in, is that we want our soul to merge with this universal spirit, our spirit to merge with this universal spirit, and that's going to bring us happiness. So that's the piece there. The third piece about Brahmanism, which is important, is they believe in karma and reincarnation. And so basically, depending on how you live your life will depend on how you'll be born. Your Atman is where that is sort of calibrated. And if you're not the perfect person, that will be reborn, reincarnated into another person. And what one tries to do at this time is to try to reach what Buddhists would call nirvana, and these folks talk about is moksha, M-O-K-S-H-A, moksha, and it basically means enlightenment. And the idea here is that life is difficult. My guess is that the average lifespan, and this is based on a peripheral reading of the scholarship here, the average lifespan is probably 20 years. I think many people live till they're 40, but so many babies die at birth that I think when you put them together, it's probably 40, and within the first year, it probably comes out to 20. I am pretty clear in terms of my reading of demography over historically, is that it was not until only a few hundred years ago that almost anybody in the world, most people in the world, live much past 40. That's sort of where folks were. So back up 2,500 years. So therefore, life was difficult. You can imagine, to be reborn and born and born again and have all the trials and tribulations. The hot tub was not that available all the time to these folks. And the hot tub Sundays and all that good stuff, and Netflix, it was just not there to sort of like bring those creature comforts to folks. And I know I'm being light here, but the point is and I didn't understand this for a long time. Both the Buddhists and eventually what becomes Hinduism, the Brahmins, they don't want to be reborn. They want to escape the cycle of rebirth. It's called the cycle of samsara, of constant rebirth. And so the goal of this tradition, as well as Buddhism, is to reach a state of nirvana, of enlightenment, so that we are not reborn. And again, we have to live a very enlightened life to do so. Now, in terms of human history, I found this really interesting when I came across this. Most religions are what are called exoteric, E-X-O-teric, T-E-R-I-C, exoteric, which means I grew up the good Irish Catholic boy. I went to Catholic church every Sunday. I love church. I still love church. I love church. Anyways. But it was, Catholicism, Christianity, there is God, there is Jesus. You will be saved by Jesus. You open yourself up and you are saved. In Islam, Allah, right, is that Islam means to surrender. You surrender yourself and open your life, you surrender your life to Allah. Judaism, there is a God. In all of these religions, salvation comes from the outside. Is to bring that outside God head to your life, and that will bring you salvation. Both Hinduism and Buddhism are esoteric. Not exo, as in out there who comes in, but esoteric from within. So the esoteric religion means that you've got to figure it out from inside yourself. That you ask the question, who the hell am I? What am I? Why am I here? I got to figure this out. And it ain't obvious. That's why we do meditation and yoga. We help to answer that question. We help to answer the question, who am I? From the inside out. And so to think about, and again, Western religions depend on these outside God, forces of God. These two in particular come from the inside, which I find a really interesting phenomenon. Okay. So, at the time of the Buddha, the dominant culture, religion/culture, socio-religious, cultural, intellectual, dominant force is really what the Aryans have brought in, assimilated with local folks, and really what the Brahmin priests are teaching about, and now it's about, karma and reincarnation, etc. And yet it's the priests who continue to do the sacrifices. Because the sacrifices are the way to ensure that Brahman, this universal spirit, is that we're able to merge with that presence as much as possible. So these rituals, these ceremonies that the priests do to get paid, that continues as a culture. And what's new, though, is this idea of reincarnation, karma, as well as this idea of nirvana, or what they would call moksha. So the Buddha is born in eastern India. If you look at the map, India, 600 BCE, again, when you look over to the left where the Indus River is and then you move toward Matsya and, basically into the center of India, the Brahmin culture, Brahmanism is really quite strong. And yet to the right there, Magadha, Kosala, places like that, it's not that strong. And then if you jump to the back map, we move to where the Buddha grows up. And I know we looked at this last time, and I think it's worth looking at it again. And so this is the area where the Buddha lived. He traveled in this area. Again, you have the little detail on the lower left-hand side, lower left-hand corner of the map itself. And so he is born, and again, some of the sky below, birth Lumbini, marriage Kapilavastu, etc. And again, they say the birth is 624. We could debate that, right? It's not right, it's not wrong, that's an estimate. When we talk about his life in the 5th century, this is close enough. So he is born in Lumbini, which is right in Nepal today, in the Himalayas. Sakya are his people, his clan. Kapilavastu is where he grew up. And again, much of his time was spent much further to the south. Down around Magadha, Bodh where he is in the lower right-hand corner. He's enlightened. Rajagaha is the capital there. He spends a tremendous amount of time there. Magadha becomes the most important, most powerful state in all of India at that time. And the other place he spends a tremendous amount of time is Kosala. If you see where Kapilavastu up at, the middle, upper right there, Kosala and Savatthi, again, the spelling is different in Pali and in Sanskrit. It's written differently in different places. But that's the capital, and he spent a tremendous amount of time there. There he spent the last 25 rainy seasons that I'll talk about in a minute, last there. And again, it's because he was such good buddies with the kings, and we'll get to that as well. So what we have here is that the Buddha living in this incredibly dynamic place. And the fact that there's so many of these rivers here and so much water here facilitates this incredible economic and, as a result, sort of political, social, and intellectual dynamism that takes place. People are traveling on the boats. There are routes going everywhere. The world is opening up for these folks on so many levels. Okay. So Brahmanism is a place in which, the sort of religious context in which the Buddha grows up. Now, Brahmanism is the most powerful influence. It's not universally accepted. Over a period from, let's call it 1,900 BCE, 800 BCE, 700 BCE, we're talking hundreds of years. Think of, that's a long time. That's a lot of generations. That's a lot of, father to son priests who are passing on habits. And what happens is that over time, there becomes a dissenting group within Brahmanism. And what develops, because Brahmanism is all about making sure Brahman is happy, you do your job. There are 4 classes in India at that time. Your job is to do what is called your dharma, meaning your role in the world, and you do it well. It means that if you're a priest, you do your job well. If you're a soldier, you do that well. If you're a servant or a slave, you do that well. That is your dharma. And the belief was that everybody has to do their job in the world well in order for society to function. And the priests are at the top of the social ladder. And over time, people become a little bit dissatisfied with the way that the priests are what seem to be very self-serving. This is a social system. It's more like a triangle. Most people are at the bottom. There's a very, very small elite at the top. And a triangle is what scholars use to describe this. Brahmins are at the very top, relatively small, and then you have the second class where the Buddha came from. Again, Kshatriya is in Sanskrit, and it's basically the governing class, the politicians, as well as the military. And one way to think about this is feudal Europe, right? In feudal Europe, you had the Catholic Church, right? They had prestige, no question about it. Below them, you had the noblemen. They had land, the Catholic Church had a lot of land too. They were noble people, they actually ruled, right? The king usually came from the nobles, they didn't come from the church, right? So the nobles both had land, they also had status, and they had economic power, they had political power. In India, there's something similar, is that the priests are on top because they are the most respected, and they sort of make the rules for society. And yet the folks, the second layer down, is that they're the ones who, in many ways, they run society. They got the politics and they got the military. And at a certain point during this time, the priests and the first and second class, they get together. Is that the Brahmin priests do rituals to legitimize the king and the politicians, other politicians. The politicians, on the other hand, provide money for the priest, and they pay for these very, very expensive rituals. So just like the church, right, the Roman Catholic Church, you have the combination of religion and politics together, and this is what happens in India over hundreds of years. It develops. Okay? What grows is a minority group in India. Scholars do not know exactly where they come from. A lot of them think that there are those who are unhappy, who are basically Aryans, so they're part of mainstream society. They come from families, the Brahmins want society to be parents, children, you grow up, you work, you enjoy your life. The sort of Aryan culture, the Brahmin culture, is very sensual. It's about material wealth. Become wealthy. You want to have a wonderful romantic sexual life? Enjoy it to the fullest. You want to be wealthy, you want to have many children, enjoy your life. It's very much about material enjoyment. It's validating all of that. Later in life, what the Brahmins basically come to is that one should retreat. One should become the sort of grandparents, or one should retire. In fact, that materialism becomes less important. And that's when you really become a full-fledged, you develop an even greater spiritual life. So you have your youth, you have the fullness of life, and then you have retirement, in which you really focus on spirituality. And all of that supports the Brahmin system, where they're at the top of the social ladder. So you have these dissidents, and they say, I don't buy it. I don't like the fact that the Brahmins, here's another thing, the Brahmins spoke in Sanskrit. Most people didn't speak Sanskrit. They spoke a local language. And so the Brahmins, just think about this. It's like, in Russia, the language of Russia was French. If you're in the Russian court under the Tsar, you didn't speak Russian with people. The peasants spoke Russians. You spoke French for say, c'est tout à fait le français là-bas, right? It's completely French, right? And so it's the, I'm sorry. But the point is the fact that there is some folks who are not happy with the Brahmins, and so they actually take a very different route. There are the Aryans who come from very traditional society, and they join this group that becomes known as the Shramana. And that's the second group here. It says the Shramana movement. And these are like words that I had to learn once I started to read this literature. I surely didn't know what heterodox means. But it's basically this. Vedism, Brahmanism, they were the orthodox religions of the day. They were the standard. They were accepted. They were mainstream society. But if you want to be a dissident, you want to disagree with that, you become a heterodox. You move away from the singular accepted, and you become a heterodox. This heterodox movement becomes known as the Shramana movement. And this ultimately is what the Buddha becomes a part of. I'll get to his family in a second. He grows up in comfort and wealth, etc., in power. And yet this movement develops in India that develops over 200 or 300 years, again, 800, 900s, 800, 700, 600 BCE. The Buddha's born in, let's say, 500. So the Shramana movement is around for quite a while by the time he's born. It's accepted as an institution. And basically, Shramana means wanderer. And basically, these are individuals who reject Brahmin culture. Instead of getting married, having a family, trying to get wealthy, they become wanderers. They totally reject marriage. And it's really quite serious in the sense that many of them, there is this ceremony about leaving their family. When I was ordained a priest, part of the ceremony was they talked literally about leaving home. And then my priest teacher said to my beloved wife and children, girls, Daddy's not really leaving, but this is what they've been saying for a long time, so he's not going anyplace. But in India at that time, when you left, you potentially could be leaving forever. And some people, many went back, and some would see their family. But basically, parents would lose their children to the Shramana path. It's a lifelong commitment for those who follow through. So what were the Sramanas? What was their, and it begins a culture. And there's a very clear culture of which they're a part. If you will, it's a subculture. But those who are in, man, they are in. And in many ways, they're in sort of, they're bound by the sort of guidelines, and there's an ethos to it. Number one is that you wander, which means you probably don't sleep in the same place any night, any 2 nights in a row. Sleep under a tree, sleep in a cave, but you're on the move. You literally wander. The argument there is that if you stay in one place, you're attached. You have a house, you're attached to your house. How many of us like to garden and they like to make our house look good? Well, you better believe I'm attached to our house. I love our house. My beloved wife and Kim, we love where we live. You know, if we had to leave, I would be weeping. That's all about attachment. And so if you're wandering and you have no house, then you don't get upset because you don't have a house. So number one, you're ascetic, is that you minimize, instead of maximize your pleasure like the good Brahmin folks, you minimize your pleasure. Austerities, celibacy. You eat maybe only once a day. You only sleep a few hours at any given time. Imagine all of the ascetic practices, and some of them were very, very intense, very, very painful. When we talk about lying on a bed of nails, I don't know if they actually had that. But the idea was not out of context in terms of what we're talking about here. I'm not going to go into it, but one of the really interesting groups is the Jains, G-A-I-N-S, and their leader is this guy, Mahavira. And he was like the main competitor. One of the things that's interesting when the Buddha finally comes and becomes the Buddha, he's Siddhartha Gautama before that, but then he's the awakened one, the enlightened one. And yet he's got real competition for other enlightened people at that same time, and I'll get to this in a bit. But the Buddha was no slouch, man. He knew how to market, he knew how to sell his goods, which was his philosophy, his teachings, etc. Mahavira and this other, the Ajavikas, there were 3 of them, Ajavikas, the Jains, and the Buddhists. They were the 3 big main Shramana movements at the Gosala is the Ajavika leader, and he was actually a student of Mahavira, of the Jains. But how those guys lived, they were very intense. And I'll just say very briefly, the Jains believed that if you moved at all, you created bad karma. I mean, you didn't have to do something bad, you just moved. Karma means action, and therefore action creates bad karma. And Jains, and again, I've read enough of this, it was too unusual at the beginning to say, really? But the fact is, I think it's actually well found, established. At the day, the full-fledged Jain monks, men and women, they would get into a posture and not move. And their liberation would come from, in many ways, they would starve themselves to death. Because they wouldn't move. Jains were not farmers, they were merchants. Jains would, at that time, we wear masks, they wore masks all the time, but not because of COVID or germs. Their fear was that just walking down the street, they may inhale insects. Ahimsa, non-violence, was like the blood and guts of the Jains. They were a radical non-violence. Therefore, they wore masks so that they wouldn't swallow any teeny tiny insects. And they would often sweep. The real intentions, they would have a broom wherever they walked so that they would sweep in front of them so that they didn't step on the insects that were on the ground. So these were part of the Shramana movements. The Buddha, the Buddhists, the Jains, as well as the Ajivikas. And so when we talk about ascetic, we're talking about a level of asceticism that I think would be very difficult for even us to imagine. So the Buddha is born into this, right? He grows up in Kapilavastu. A lot of the popular literature about Buddhism says that his father is a king, Suddhodana, his father. They call him a king because he's often described as R-A-J-A, Raja, however it's pronounced in Pali or Sanskrit, I don't know. But in English we say Raja, right, which means kings. Rajasthan, something like that. His father was not a king. His father, the Kapilavastu was a small republic, the Sakya people, his clan. And they had tribes which were like, so you had families, got together with tribes, and then you had a bunch of tribes, and then you form a clan, and that was the Sakya clan. The elders of the clans would get together, what I talked about before, and they would have assemblies. And that's where they made their political decisions, right? It was participatory. It was republic in the sense that it was participatory and people made decisions. They had very, very clear rules about debate, about proposals, about how things were approved. And so the Buddha grew up in this environment. The leader of the community was chosen by this group of elders. And they would hold office for a certain period of time. The Buddha's father was that guy. He was chosen by the local people, by the elders, by this little oligarchic, meaning the sort of privileged folks, to be like the mayor, the governor, whatever you call it. You know, the mayor would be just a city, the governor would be a region, and it was more the governor. The Buddha was not a prince. The Buddha was the son of the governor who may or may not have been reelected every 2 or 5 years. Just because you're elected once, it's not governor for life. It's not hereditary like the kings. And that's why they call it a republic. It's not hereditary. The Buddha had no guarantee whatsoever. Siddhartha Gautama, however you pronounce his name. No guarantee whatsoever that he's going to take over his father's position. And yet, he was educated as if he were prepared to. He studied the military, language, logic, whatever they studied, math. I mean, there was a curriculum that wealthy kids, he supposedly had tutors. There's the belief among some that he traveled all the way to Gandhara, which was way on the other side, northwestern India. No proof of it, but there are some who speculate. So, the Buddha grows up in this place, and one of the things that's important is that the Buddha becomes very friendly with the kings, and I'll get to this, the 2 great kings of his day, in Kosala and in Magadha. And the thing is that, number one, he's used to talking to rich people. He's used to talking to politicians. He's got the best education. He has traveled as widely as, some upper middle class, lower upper class kid at his time would be. There are all sorts of stories. Did he have 4 palaces, and he had each palace for different reasons? We don't know. I don't know. We don't know. And so the point being that the Buddha steps into this Shramana culture. He's married as a young man, married, of course, a beautiful princess. He's supposed to be a superstar. He's like the guy. Handsome, athletic, can fight. He can do it all. Good looking. He's got the look, he's got the talk. He can do it. He marries a beautiful princess. At the age of 29, he's had enough of domestic life. Gets up and he walks up in the middle of the night. It's the story. Baby's there, his child, a month old, and his wife, beloved wife. There they are. He walks over. He begins with that. And it's interesting, these great figures. It's like, what does Jesus ask the apostles to do? Leave your family, follow me. Where do the women? What happens to the women and the church? It's like Obama becoming president. He's not home as much as he did. They help the greater good, right? It's a tough one. So anyways, the Buddha heads off, and he steps right into this Shramana stream with these well-known, very, very prominent teachers. He studies with them, and before long he says, I can't learn anything more. He goes out, the story goes, it's 6 years, And during that time, he takes on more and more ascetic practices. You know, he's got the yoga, he's got the meditation, he's got it done. He's a superstar. This guy's a superstar. And even as a young man, one of the Visara, one of the kings, sees Siddhartha Gautama soon after he's on his way. And the king, he's a king. And he sees this young 30-year-old walking down the path, and he said, "Who is that?" And his servants call him over and says, I want you to be, I want you to come and I'll give you some land." And the Buddha says, "No, this is young Siddhartha still on his path. No, I'm on a path to enlightenment. I'm a long way from there." He says, "But I'll come back." And he comes back, 6-7 years later. The point being, again, this is a story of him being this handsome, dynamic, very charismatic guy. And there may be some truth. He goes on his own for 6 years, unbelievable. He gets to a point where he basically stops eating. He becomes so weak. You usually have the statues of the Buddha, he looks cool with his robes and stuff, nice and healthy. But some of them you see nothing but a skeleton. And the story goes that when you looked at his stomach, he was so thin, so weak. When you looked at his stomach, you could see the bones of his skeleton, meaning he was emaciated. And the story goes is that he almost died, and in this week, and then this young girl comes and feeds him, cow girl or goat girl or sheep or whatever she's tending, gives him some milk. And he basically realizes, at that point, he realizes that extreme asceticism is not the way to go. And he develops what he calls the middle path. The middle path between the Brahmin life of materialism, where you never get enough. There's always more ice cream in the refrigerator. God help me, I hope there is. Right? Really. Here, and then the asceticism here is that I'm never going to eat ice cream in my whole life, even though I'm just going to be in pain. Because I'm going to get enlightened through it. And the Buddha says, "No, dude, let's walk the middle path. Don't go too far this way. Don't go too far this way." And he basically, I'll get to this, he embraces a moderate asceticism for his day. And some of the other folks over here, the Ajivikas as well as the Jains, they accuse the Buddha of being too soft. This is a guy, supposedly his daily habits, once he's enlightened, is to sleep 1 hour a day between 3 and 4 o'clock. The rest of the time he's teaching or traveling, which he did all the time. And so he joins the Shravana movement. He becomes a solo player after a certain point. After 6 years, he sits under a tree. He feels he has developed far enough, and the story goes, "I will not wake up until I am fully awake." And the story goes is that, again, different parts of the Buddhist now literature, the Buddhist canon says different stories. He has this 3 great awakenings during the night. By the morning, this morning star comes up. He wakes up, touches the ground, and says, "The earth is my witness. The earth is my witness that I am the Buddha. I am the awakened one." And, the trumpet sound and so forth and so on. He's not sure if he's going to do anything. Because he's reached nirvana. He's not going to be reborn. Right? So he can meditate the rest of his life and he'd be totally happy. Story goes, one of the Brahmin gods shows up. Brahma shows up actually and says, Buddha's afraid that it's too esoteric, right? He had to do this intense asceticism, even if he comes, not too extreme, but to wake up. He's not sure if most people can do this, because it's a Brahmin culture, it's materialistic, etc. And finally, supposedly the god Brahma says to him, there will be some people who will never, ever, shall I speak louder? Okay?
Yeah, a little bit, please.
Sorry. So he says, thank you. you know, supposedly God says to him, some people will never ever understand your teachings. But he said there will be people who do understand it. And therefore, if you're going to help these folks out, then you've got to do the teaching. He eventually does so and literally spends the next 45 years, and most scholars agree about this, spends the next 45 years teaching on a pretty non-stop basis. So, let's talk about his Sangha that he gathers around him. There are lots of details that I find interesting, but we'll save for another day. And he makes his way to find 5 of his colleagues who were Shramanas as well, and they traveled together during their time together. You know, Shramanas sometimes traveled in groups, they traveled alone. And he finds them, make a long story short, he gives his first sermon, and he lays out his teachings, what we call the Buddha Dharma, the Buddhist teachings. And I guess I don't have it. Last week I brought a guide for Buddhism that talks about the Four Noble Truths, it talks about karma, things like this. But I'll just tell you briefly, and there's a lot more to say about it, but basically what he argues, the 4 truths are basically that, you know, life is both, you know, it's called dukkha, it's suffering, life can be difficult. Number 2, there's a cause that we crave things, we hang on to things, our opinions, our possessions. 3, there's a way out of it. Number 4, there's a path, we call it the Eightfold Path, which is basically, you know, live a moral life, do the right thing, meditate, be mindful, and, you know, you'll be able to free yourself of basically self-created pain and suffering. And again, this gets to a little bit about what I said early on, and, you know, to synthesize and condense the teachings. You know, when the Buddha talks about our suffering comes from craving or attachment. And for us, what that means on a practical basis is the fact that, you know, we have this self, this sense of self. You know, my name, oh, I'm Tom, oh, I'm a professor, oh, I'm a Buddhist, oh, I'm married to Kim, she's the love of my life, I love my children, you know, I love them all. This is sort of my stuff that I carry around all day long. I'm attached to that. I hold on to that stuff. And the idea is that this is a construct, that all of us have created this sense of self. Because we're human. And what we're trying to do is sort of let go of a lot of that stuff. Let go of all of it, maybe just too much. But the more we let go of our possessions, of our identity, the more we're patient with people, our feelings aren't hurt as much. We basically learn to live a life of openness, of non-separation, and of compassion. And so the Buddha, what he brought in addition to his teaching clearly is that he brought what we can only call anything short of charisma, is this enlightenment was clear to people who met him. And what happens is that the Buddha takes on a role that a lot of the Shramanas took on in his day. Some of the Shramanas may have become enlightened and they would become a hermit, literally. They live in a hut, they live in a cave. The other thing that Shramanas do, of course, is that they beg, right? They would beg for food, for their sustenance. And so these folks, you know, living as a hermit, they'd have to figure that out, but that would usually be a part of it. And so what happens is that the Buddha decides he's going to be a teacher. He is going to spread his awakening, his insight, his enlightenment with others out of compassion. because he cares about the world, out of compassion for others. He's going to share with them what he won, what he was able to obtain. In his argument is, they can have what I have. I'm happy as hell. I'm content. I'm serene, and I'm not going to be reborn. And why wouldn't I share that with the world? His entire life after that is committed to sharing that with the world. Within a short period of time, he has a small gathering. And the story goes, it could be a matter of a month, but surely by the end of the first year, I think it's a matter of months, but let's just call it by the end of the first year, he's got 60 people, full-fledged disciples. And these are people who say, okay, Master, I want you to be my teacher, and will you be my teacher? And he will say, you're part of my Sangha, right? Sangha means group or community. You're part of my Sangha. He's got 60 of them. And the story goes that these folks all became enlightened simply by being in contact with him. By being a close student of his and being a disciple at that level, they became enlightened and would not be reborn. He pulls the 60 together. This is very important historically in terms of the Buddha. And he says to them, I have a job for you. He says, out of compassion for the world, for the good of the world, I want you to go out and teach the Dharma, meaning the Buddha Dharma, the teachings that I have taught you, that I have bestowed upon you. He says, I want all 60 of you to go all in separate directions. And they're off. Buddhism was and is a missionary religion, even though soon we'll find out that it becomes somewhat residential, if you will. There's always been a missionary component. My teachers' teachers were Japanese Buddhist monks, Zen Buddhist monks, who were told by their teachers to go to the United States of America and bring the Dharma. They end up in Los Angeles. Maizumi Roshi opens the Zen Center of Los Angeles, and 60 years later, they have this very, very dynamic community that continues. People come to the Buddha, and he sends them out. There's no requirement early on for his followers. You want to be with me? Here's my teaching. Go teach it to others. They're on the go. They're peripatetic. They're walking everywhere. And at a certain point, the numbers begin to grow significantly. And the Buddha's getting reports from the popular people on the street. I saw one of your monks there, and they were drinking. I saw one of your monks there, and they were talking to this young woman. I saw one of your monks there. And so what happens is that as the Buddha's Sangha grows, he understands that there's got to be some quality control of the folks who are actually in it. And so over time, two things happen. It grows and grows, and he's got to sort of rein it in terms of the rules and the guidelines. Because people join a group like this for all sorts of reasons. And I'll come back to this in a few minutes. But early on, let me make there's one event that's absolutely crucial to this entire story. One of the things that I've come to the conclusion is that the Buddha, here's my single takeaway, if you will, was two parts. The Buddha's life was about teaching his Dharma, teaching his path to enlightenment, because he was a compassionate person who wanted the world to be as happy as possible. Out of compassion, he wanted people to sort of have what he had. The second part of that was that in order for it to happen, he had to have a very strong community of followers who could spread this word, because he was one person. India's a huge place. And number two, he's going to die. And he wants it to continue as long as possible. And again, because it's sort of like if you're in love, you know you're in love. If you're enlightened, fully enlightened like the Buddha, you know you're enlightened. He didn't need verification from anybody. He says, what I have is what the world can benefit from which the world can benefit. Therefore, out of my love and compassion for people in this world, I'm going to spread it as much as possible. I'm going to spread the good word. As a politician, as a leader of the Sangha, that is his fundamental guideline. To keep the Sangha strong so that it will continue well after my death. So the Sangha grows. He establishes more and more rules. One of his, wasn't Ananda, anyways, one of his disciples says, geez, it's becoming huge, you've got to establish like a whole set of rules. Sariputta, one of his local disciples, close disciples, you have to make a whole system of rules. And the Buddha says, no. If something comes up, I make the rule. Something else comes up, I'll make the rule, but I'm not going to be like dogmatic, ideological. Over time, more and more situations come up. By the end of it, the male monks, there will be nuns, the men, 227, something like that. The nuns, 311, you get different numbers. So let me talk about this community. Within the first year or so in India there are the monsoons, July, August, September, October in general. Historically, the Shramanas and everybody else would basically seek shelter. The Buddha's disciples were walking all over during that time, rainy season. They were messing up the crops. They were killing insects. There was a complaint that they were causing trouble. And that the Buddha, like the other Shramanas, that he should have his disciples stay put. And so they started to build huts for 3 or 4 months during the rainy season. They would stay put. And over time, and so that was the change of rule. The first rule, in bare feet, you walk everywhere, 12 months a year. Someone complains, says, okay, 3 months, 4 months a year, you can be in the hut. A little bit later, people complained during those 8 months that the bare feet, it was very rough ground in certain parts of these places. And one of the supporters of the Buddha said, I think you should let your monks wear sandals. And the Buddha said, fine, you can wear leather sandals, but with only one strap. So it's one strap. And then one of his monks comes to him and said, Master, it's unbelievably rocky where we are. One strap, they fall off and they break. He says, okay, 2 straps. Before you know it, it was 3 straps. So number one, you go from always on the go to huts. And then as it grows, he gets patrons. Very early on, very, very rich people. During this time of incredible wealth, they build monasteries. And over time, dozens of monasteries are built by relatively wealthy people. And so what happens in the Sangha is the fact that the Buddha is competing with other teachers. Other teachers have disciples, but they also get money. And with money you can build things, and you can improve the lives of your monks, your followers. Over the period of a number of years, the Buddha changes rules time after time after time after time after time around food, around robes. At first it was one, and then it was two, and then, there was a nun who had two robes, but, exposed her body, and Buddha said, now you need three robes, and now they all need three robes, and first you couldn't have any food at the monastery, and then, anyways, before you know it, they're cooking, and they have lots of food, etc. But everything is based on a very pragmatic basis. The Buddha was incredibly pragmatic. Very quickly about women, right? Some of you heard the story. Is that, historically at that time, women were, they were basically owned by their fathers, owned by their husbands, and and then by their brothers, and when their husbands died, it was by their sons. They were subject to their whim. And so the Buddha's mother died right after birth. Her sister, the Buddha's aunt, raised him. She comes to him after a short time, a few years, whenever, but a short period of time, where he only has monks, right? It's only male followers. And she says, I want to join you. He says, no, you're a woman. That's not going to go well, basically, with the public. And she comes back, and his assistant, Ananda, good old Ananda, his young cousin, says, but Master, you said women can be enlightened, but you're not going to let them as part of your community. He said, no, we're not going to. 3 times Ananda asked, finally the Buddha says yes. And yet there is all sorts of rules that the Buddha imposes upon the nuns. That if a nun's been a nun for 50 years and some, male apprentice monk shows up 2 hours later, the 50 seniority nun has to bow to him. He can criticize her, she can't criticize him. If she has food, he can take food from her, but she can't take any food from him. They're treated as second-class citizens within the Sangha. And so the point there is that number one is that the Buddha in many ways was very radical by allowing women into the Sangha in the first place. Because the Brahmin social model was the fact that you're a young person, you get married, if you're a woman, you have children, and later in life you actually develop a spiritual life along with your husband, but you basically take care of your family. So the idea of a young woman or an older woman, any woman going on her own, and she's living in a nunnery, a monastery of women, and they rule themselves even though the monks have certain oversight, but they're fairly independent. And so the Buddha is sort of taking the middle road between he's going far in terms of allowing women, but he's not going so far because he allows the men to have seniority status within his community. The Sangha grows, and his monks are traveling wide. Eventually they're going to make their way throughout all of Southeast Asia. At the end of his life, the question is, who's going to be his successor? Who's going to follow in his footsteps? He had some very, very dynamic, very strong disciples at his side. And the Buddha, Nanda, right before he dies, he said, Master, who is going to lead the Sangha? And he said, the leader of the Sangha will be my Dharma, my teaching. And to everyone's great surprise, it's his teaching. And again, everything's oral at this point. And let me bring a close to the Sangha. I need to say a couple of things about the large process. As soon as the Buddha dies, soon thereafter, they have what's called the first council. His main disciples get 500 monks together, and they basically establish the first 2 parts of what's called the Buddha canon. The Vinaya, which are the rules of the monks, and the sutras. The Sutra Vinaya in the sutras, they're the teachings of the Buddha, and they establish the first part of what's the canon, the established teachings of the Buddha. So very, very shortly, they establish his teachings, and they basically, the jobs of the monks is to memorize it and pass it down through the generations, which is exactly what happened. These are not written down for 200 to 300 years. He dies in 400, and it's pretty well understood that it's not until in Sri Lanka, 50, 70 BCE, in the first century BCE, that it's written down. So we're talking 300 years later, and all of his teachings are passed down orally, which is a whole very, very interesting subject unto itself. So the point being here is that the Buddha, this is very interesting, right before he died, Ananda asked about this very issue of the Dharma. And the Buddha says, I've never seen myself. I was fairly shocked when I read this. I never saw myself as the leader of the Sangha. I was the guide. I was the teacher. He says, I never saw myself as governing the Sangha. And so in terms of the Sangha, he was, in fact, he was the leader because of his reputation. And, Max Weber, the great sociologist, has a whole thing on leadership, and he talked about a style of leadership called charismatic. The Buddha's clearly fit into this charismatic leadership. He didn't need a title. He didn't need a position. His person was so dynamic, so charismatic. His achievements were so profound. His teachings were so effective that his person was able to lead folks simply out of the integrity and the incredible depth that he brought to his presence among them. But it's very interesting to think about this. He didn't see himself as the authority, but he simply, it sort of grew from who he was. So this idea of leader as teacher, I think, is a very, very interesting one. Now, let me just digress completely. Star.
So we need to have everything cleared in and put away, and the doors closed at 9.
At 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
Now, how long does it take? Is it 20 minutes?
I would say it would take at least 20 minutes, because we need the sound put away, and Maria needs time to pack up and everything.
All right.
Yeah.
So if folks can help us set up, can we go 10 more minutes? I know it's late, you've been incredibly patient and resilient. Let me move to the political realm. There are 2 grades. If you look at the map, the one that says 600, in 1000 BCE, there were basically no kings in India. They come in, Kuru, Kuru, that and Panchala, those are the first real modern sort of kings, what we would call, in political science, the state, sort of a full government. And what's happening is this incredible development is taking place in eastern India. There's also political consolidation. Not only is iron good for a plow and an axe, it's also good for a sword and a shield. And as wealth grows in the area, you have individuals who are able to accumulate wealth and political influence, and they become the political vanguard. And so what happens is that by the time the Buddha shows up, what 500 years before had been basically all small sort of local running governments, many of them were assemblies. You may have had like local dictators, kings or rajas, but everything's on a really relatively modest scale. 300, 400 years, 700, 600 BCE, you have a whole political consolidation that takes place at the same time as this incredible economic development. And so by the time the Buddha is alive, there's what's called the 6 things, Mahajanapadas. Maha is the word for great or big, and Janapada means state, or they sometimes use country, but we would call it a state. And so these are the great political entities at that time. And they don't have strict borders like we do. You know, here's Vermont, there's Massachusetts, here's the line, you cross it. It's not, it's fluid. Again, India is a very wide open country at this time. Everybody's walking. People don't have, you know, there are a few horses, but not very many. People are walking everywhere. So things are moving. Traveling by boat in many ways is much quicker. So what happens is that you have these 2 centers of power. Kosala, which is basically controls Kapilavastu, controls the town where he grew up. And what that meant is Kapilavastu would pay them taxes, and you know, they would never do anything in terms of like military or anything like that in terms of foreign policy without the Kosala king agreeing to it. So they were like subjects of Kosala. So the Buddha grew up in that context. He's sort of this wealthy kid who, you know, is well educated. His father's a hotshot, but they're also under the control of a local power. The great power is Magadha, down in the southeast. It's a center of trade. If you look at the, you know, when you look at the river basin there, a lot of the rivers come down and they all come together. The capital was Rajagaha. Look above on a small map there. Oh, there, it's actually in the big map there too. That's the capital there. It's a great, huge trading center. It's the capital of Magadha. The Buddha becomes allies and friends, and to a certain teachers of the 2 kings of Kosala and Magadha. The great king of Magadha is a guy by the name of Bimbisara, and he's this historic figure. Kosala is Pasaneda, and these are these 2 like giant figures in India at that time. They're very wealthy, they're very powerful. The Buddha's point is that he maintains excellent, and I mean excellent, relations with both of them. And the logic is very, very simple. India is an incredibly violent place at that time. These kings had incredible power to do anything they wanted when they wanted. And killing people on a large scale was never out of the question. Just as proof of how volatile it was, and I make the point that the Buddha was very, very smart strategically. He knew where the power was. He made sure he was in their good graces all the time. He could talk their language. They respected him. He supported them. They supported him. And it's not always a pretty picture, though, and he has to make some moral compromises. But let me, before I get to that, this tells you how volatile it was. Bimbisara is the king of Magadha. He's literally the most powerful man in all of India. His son murders him to take the throne, which he does. The Buddha was very, very good friends with Bimbisara, who was just murdered by his son. The Buddha never ever criticizes the son because he needs to stay in good relationship with the king. One may think that you say, that's not okay. That's being very violent. He never ever breaches it with him. But this is how volatile it is. Bimbisara is murdered by his son. His son is, I have all these names, but I'm just going to jump through them. His son is murdered by his son. His son is murdered by his son. There are 5 what are called patricides. The king is killed by his son 5 times in a row. In the most powerful state in all of India. That's how sort of insecure people were. Even if you're the king of the most powerful state in India, you may be murdered by your own children. This is a scary thing. So the Buddha sort of never intervened. Bimbisara's son, Ajatasattu, I'm sorry about the names. Ajatasattu is his name. Ajatasattu is going to invade Magadha. If you look on the map here, it says Vijayijji. He wants to invade him. This is what kings did. If you became a ruler, you sort of expanded. That was part of your job. Become more powerful, more wealthy. He has his representative, goes to the king and says, I'm going to invade these folks. We're talking deaths of tens of thousands of people. The Buddha never says that's a bad idea. Don't do it. What the Buddha says is that the Vahiyans, the people, are really, they have a very strong government and they're really together. They're very cohesive people, and therefore they're really cohesive, basically saying, if you invade, it's going to be difficult. But he never ever does it. What does Ajatasattu do? He basically waits some time, and then he invades, and he takes over the place. We're killing thousands and thousands of people. Precariousness. But the Buddha never criticizes him. There is the time in which, in Kosala, that the son of the king of Kosala, his other great friend, the king is also, that king, his good buddy, is also killed by his son. So he never criticizes him for killing the father, who's his good friend. And in addition to that, the son tells the Buddha that he's going to invade the Sakya clan, where the Buddha is from. His people, his like blood, he's going to invade. 3 times in a row, the Buddha sort of stood out in the field and stopped him. The 4th time, the Buddha realized he couldn't stop them, and the invasion takes place. And basically, much of his clan was absolutely, and the word that is in the text was, they were annihilated. The Buddha did not intervene with the kings, even when it came to these massive events of horrific, terrifying violence. Because he made the calculation, if I oppose them, they could not only destroy, they probably wouldn't kill him, but they could harm his people, his Sangha, without thinking twice. If you can kill your father, who's the king, you can sure as heck kill the followers of the Buddha. So it's very interesting, and I'll end here, that the Buddha's modus operandi, his sort of way of leading, was number one, as a teacher, not as a governor so much in terms of his community. He had a lot of latitude, but it was really his great person and his accomplishments and his integrity that really carried the day. In terms of the geopolitical reality of that part of India at that time, he was in tune enough to the reality that his Sangha could be destroyed in a moment's notice if he challenged the kings too much. And therefore, even though there was horrific violence done while he was sort of witnessing it, he would hold his voice, he would hold his criticism, and try to work long-term with the kings so that they became more loving, more kind, less violent, etc. But it was a strategy that, from Gandhian, point of view, that was not the sort of, I will stand for my principles above all else. But again, he comes down to, I teach the Dharma, the Sangha is indispensable and the vehicle to carry it on through history. And here's the interesting thing, and I'll end on this. 2,500 years later, the Buddhist Sangha has continued to exist and to a certain extent thrive without any break whatsoever. So his strategy, the Buddhist strategy to use the Sangha to carry out his message and his teachings and the way that he did it 2,500 years ago is probably the oldest organization that continues to operate, and therefore probably we can say it wasn't a terrible strategy altogether. So you've been very patient. I know we got to end here. I'm sorry that I went on longer than I had hoped. I hope this was helpful, and thank you, sweetheart. And so the next talk is December 21st. I'll try to be a little more brief, which will be a challenge, but I'll do my best. I'm happy to hang out outside and talk out there.